Right. So you wanted like a deep dive on how science actually like works,
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
the book you sent us, what is this thing called Science by Alan Chalmers, I think is a
Mhm.
perfect place to start.
A classic.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it's not just like dry definitions.
Right.
We're talking about swan myths.
Uh-huh.
We're talking about Galileo dropping stuff off the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and even how scientists use probability,
Yeah.
like gamblers. So it's pretty fascinating stuff.
It really challenges you to think about
Yeah,
what we consider scientific knowledge.
definitely.
Yeah.
One of the first things that really struck me was just how much our understanding of science has changed
Right.
over time. you know?
Yeah.
I mean, like before the 17th century, it seems like people just kind of accepted things based on,
Authorities.
Aristotle or,
The Bible.
religious texts.
Yeah.
Could you imagine?
It's fascinating how knowledge was approached back then. But that reliance on authority really started to shift with figures like Galileo,
Right.
who really started to challenge those long-held assumptions.
Mm.
The famous experiment of dropping balls from the Leaning Tower of Pisa to debunk Aristotle's theories
Mhm.
about falling objects really highlights that turning point toward observation-based science.
I love that image of Galileo up on that tower cropping those balls.
Uh-huh.
It just feels so symbolic, this
Yeah.
shift in thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So from there, we kind of move into this idea of inductivism, which at first glance seems pretty straightforward. You
Right?
make observations,
Yeah.
you notice patterns, and then you kind of make these generalizations.
Yeah.
Like you experience a few scorching summers.
Sure.
You might think, okay, all summers are hot.
Right.
Yeah, inductivism has a certain appeal. It seems objective.
Yeah.
You're simply basing your conclusions on what you're observing.
Right.
But Chalmers points out some major flaws with relying solely on our senses.
Okay, so what could go wrong with just observing and drawing conclusions?
Well, think about optical illusions.
Right, yeah.
They trick our eyes
Right.
into seeing things that aren't actually there.
Sure.
It shows how easily our senses can be fooled.
Yeah, I guess so.
Mm.
I mean, we all know
Well-
perception can be subjective,
Mm-hmm.
but in science, we use instruments,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Measurements to be more objective.
Even with instruments, prior knowledge can really influence what we observe.
I see.
Someone familiar with interpreting data from a complex scientific instrument
Mm-hmm.
will see different things than someone who's seeing that data for the first time.
Right?
And that's not even getting into limitations of the instruments themselves.
Right. We're always interpreting data through
Yeah.
some kind of lens, even in science. So how
Yeah.
do we...
That's one of the big questions that
Yeah.
Chalmers grapples with.
Okay.
And it leads us to, the issue of limited observations. For centuries, people in Europe only ever saw white swans, leading to the assumption that all swans were white.
Okay.
Then black swans were discovered in Australia,
Right.
completely overturning that truth.
Wow.
This is the famous black swan problem.
Okay.
It shows how a limited set of observations can lead to false conclusions.
That's a powerful analogy.
Yeah,
Just a reminder that you should never assume you have the whole picture, even in science.
right.
So I guess, but doesn't science still rely on observation?
Well,
I mean, how do we get around that problem?
that's where another pivotal figure comes in, Karl Popper.
Okay.
He proposed a different way of thinking about science called falsificationism.
Okay.
It flips the script on how we approach scientific knowledge.
How so?
Instead of trying to prove things true,
Okay.
we should be actively trying to prove them false.
So like playing devil's advocate
Exactly.
with your own theories.
And it's actually a much more rigorous
Okay.
approach.
Yeah.
Chalmers gives that fascinating example of scientists trying to figure out how bats navigate in the dark.
Uh-huh.
They deliberately hindered their senses
Like how?
one by one
Yeah.
to test different hypotheses.
I see.
They covered their eyes, then
Yeah.
they covered their ears, then they covered their mouths.
Wow.
Each step was designed to disprove a potential explanation,
Okay.
and it led them to the discovery of echolocation.
That's amazing. So that's like
That's falsificationism.
falsificationism
In action.
In action, yeah.
It's logical,
Okay.
it's iterative,
Yeah.
and it focuses on eliminating possibilities.
I see.
It forces scientists to constantly refine and test their hypotheses,
Right.
leading to a much more robust understanding.
He definitely sounds more dynamic
Absolutely.
than just trying to confirm what you already believe.
It's about embracing the possibility of being wrong and using that to drive scientific progress.
But even this seemingly foolproof method, I'm sure, has
Yes.
limitations, right?
Falsificationism isn't a perfect system. One major issue is the possibility of flawed experimental conditions.
Right.
Early telescopes, for example, gave inaccurate readings of the planets, leading to incorrect rejections of some astronomical theories.
But it's not just about coming up with a test. But
it's about making sure that your tools and your methods are reliable.
Exactly. Yeah. And
then there's the issue of rejecting potentially valuable hypotheses too early. What if, due to limitations in our current knowledge, we dismiss an idea that might actually be revolutionary?
Right.
Think about Copernicus proposing that the Earth rotates on its axis.
Yeah.
At the time, they didn't understand inertia, so the idea seemed ridiculous.
Wow.
Because they couldn't explain why, if you drop something, it doesn't land behind you.
Right. It makes you wonder how many groundbreaking ideas have been dismissed.
It's a thought-provoking.
Simply because they didn't fit with the existing understanding.
Yeah, and it leads us to another key aspect of science. The role of paradigms.
Ah, yes. Paradigms.
Yeah.
These big picture frameworks that shape entire fields of study.
Enter Thomas Kuhn and his revolutionary concept of paradigms.
Okay.
These are overarching theoretical frameworks that guide scientific thought.
Okay.
Think about Newtonian mechanics. For centuries, that was the dominant paradigm for understanding the physical world.
Yeah.
It provided a set of rules, concepts, and assumptions that scientists worked within.
So it's kind of like a set of guidelines that tell scientists where to focus their attention and how to approach problems.
Exactly.
But wouldn't that kind of framework limit creativity?
That's where it gets counterintuitive.
Really?
A paradigm's lack of absolute precision can actually be a strength.
How so?
Think of it like this. Parents give their children freedom to explore and learn, but within certain boundaries.
Right.
Similarly, paradigms provide a framework, but with enough flexibility for scientists to explore and push boundaries.
So this is more like a map.
That's good.
With some blank spaces.
Way to put it.
Yeah.
You have a general direction, but you also have the freedom to discover new territories.
I like that. And these paradigms.
And remember, paradigms aren't meant to last forever.
Right.
Scientific progress often happens in leaps and bounds when old paradigms are challenged and new ones emerge.
That's exciting.
It can definitely feel that way.
But also maybe a little chaotic.
Yeah.
You know, you're working within this framework, and then suddenly everything you thought you knew is being overturned.
But that's part of what makes science so dynamic and fascinating. It's about constantly questioning, testing, and sometimes completely overturning existing paradigms.
And this leads us to some newer views of science.
Yeah, like Bayesianism.
Right. So we've talked about these big shifts in scientific thought, from relying on authority to observation, and from trying to prove things true to actively trying to disprove them, and from working within those established paradigms to completely overturning them. But where does that leave us today? How do scientists actually use evidence to build and refine our understanding of the world?
That's a great question. And while those historical shifts provide important context, Chalmers also dives into some newer views of science that are very much relevant today. One that you might find particularly intriguing is Bayesianism.
Bayesianism. Okay, I've heard that term thrown around, but I'll admit I'm a little fuzzy on what it actually means.
It's all about using probability to update our beliefs about theories as new evidence comes in.
Probability. So are you saying scientists are basically sophisticated gamblers?
Yeah. In a way, yes, but instead of betting on horses or cards, they're evaluating the likelihood of different scientific theories being true based on the available evidence. And just like a smart gambler adjusts their bets as they get new information, Bayesian scientists continuously refine their confidence in a theory as new data emerges.
It actually makes a lot of sense. I remember Chalmers using a sports analogy to explain this, something about a diehard fan adjusting their predictions about their team's chances based on new information, like an injured player or something.
Exactly. Imagine you're a dedicated fan of a football team, let's say Manchester United. You're pretty confident they'll win their upcoming match, maybe giving them like a 90% chance of victory based on their recent performance, but then news breaks that their star striker is injured. A Bayesian approach would lead you to adjust that probability downward maybe to 70% or even 60%, because that new evidence has changed your assessment of the situation.
So it's about constantly recalibrating your beliefs as the facts on the ground change. But how does this apply to, like, real scientific research?
It's used in a wide range of fields, for instance. A scientist studying the effectiveness of a new drug might start with a hypothesis based on initial lab results as they conduct clinical trials and gather more data. They'll apply Bayesian reasoning to update their confidence in that hypothesis. If the new data consistently supports their initial idea, their confidence grows. But if the data starts to contradict their hypothesis, they'll adjust their assessment accordingly, maybe even abandoning the hypothesis altogether.
So it's this dynamic process of constant refinement and adaptation driven by what the evidence is revealing.
Precisely, and that highlights one of the key strengths of Bayesianism. It emphasizes the importance of being open to new evidence and adjusting our understanding accordingly.
That sounds very much in line with the spirit of scientific inquiry we've been discussing, always questioning, always refining, always seeking a more accurate picture of reality. But is all scientific progress driven by testing specific theories? What about those moments of discovery that seem to come out of nowhere, those aha moments that change the game completely?
You've hit upon another crucial aspect of how science works, which is the role of experimentation. Even in the absence of a clearly defined theory, this is where new experimentalism comes into play.
New experimentalism. That sounds intriguing. So it's about letting go of preconceived notions and just seeing what happens.
There's definitely an element of that. It's about designing clever experiments that can challenge existing assumptions and generate new knowledge even without a pre-existing theoretical framework to guide them.
So it's a bit like those explorers who set sail for uncharted territories, not knowing exactly what they'd find, but with a thirst for discovery and a sense of adventure.
I love that analogy. New experimentalism encourages a sense of exploration and openness to unexpected results. Then it can lead to incredible breakthroughs.
Thinking about all these different approaches, inductivism, falsificationism, paradigms, Bayesianism, new experimentalism, makes you wonder about some of the really big questions like, can we ever truly understand how the world works? What are scientific laws? Really, we take them for granted, but when you stop to think about it, it's all a bit mind-boggling.
You're right. Those are some of the deepest and most fascinating questions in science, and Chalmers doesn't shy away from exploring them. He even delves into the philosophical challenges raised by David Hume, who famously questioned the very notion of causation.
Wait, questioning causation, isn't that like questioning gravity? It seems like a pretty fundamental concept.
It might sound radical, but Hume had a point. He argued that what we perceive as cause and effect might simply be a consistent pattern of events, not necessarily a true causal relationship.
So just because we observe two things happening together repeatedly doesn't mean one is actually causing the other.
Precisely. Think about the classic example of a rooster crowing before sunrise. We might observe this happening day after day, but does the rooster's crowing actually cause the sun to rise? Obviously not. There are other factors at play, a deeper underlying mechanism that we understand as Earth's rotation.
That's a great example. It seems so obvious, but it highlights how easily we can mistake correlation for causation. So if simple regularity isn't enough to define scientific laws, how do we make sense of them?
That's where things get really interesting. Chalmers points us towards the concept of laws as characterizations of powers or dispositions.
Powers or dispositions. Now you've really piqued my curiosity. What does that even mean?
Think of it this way. Objects possess inherent abilities to act or behave in certain ways. We call these dispositions. Take flammability, for example. A piece of wood has the disposition to burn under certain conditions, but that doesn't mean it's constantly on fire. It's an inherent property, a potential that can be activated under the right circumstances.
So instead of just describing patterns, we're trying to understand the underlying properties that govern how things behave.
Exactly. It's about moving beyond mere observation and delving into the deeper nature of reality.
This is all incredibly mind-blowing. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of a very complex and fascinating subject after this deep dive into Chalmers' book. Where do we stand? What are some of the key takeaways our listeners should ponder?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that there's no single definitive answer to the question, what is this thing called science? It's a constantly evolving process with multiple perspectives, approaches, and even philosophies intertwined.
It's actually quite liberating in a way. It means science isn't some rigid set of rules, but a dynamic and ever-changing quest for knowledge.
Exactly. And while we've explored several key methods, from inductivism and falsificationism to paradigms, Bayesianism, and new experimentalism, it's essential to understand that each has its strengths and weaknesses. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
So it's like having a toolkit, with a variety of instruments.
A perfect analogy.
Each suited for different tasks.
The key is knowing which tool to use in which situation.
Right.
And recognizing that the pursuit of scientific knowledge requires flexibility, critical thinking, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty.
Speaking of critical thinking, it seems like that's been a recurring theme in our deep dive today.
It's absolutely fundamental, especially in today's world, where we're bombarded with information from all directions. Discerning what's credible and what's not is crucial. We need those critical thinking skills to navigate the information landscape effectively.
It's so easy to get swept up in sensationalized headlines or to blindly accept something just because it sounds convincing. How can we sharpen those critical thinking skills, particularly when it comes to evaluating scientific claims?
It starts with recognizing that critical thinking isn't about being cynical or dismissive.
Okay.
It's about approaching information with a healthy skepticism.
Yeah.
A willingness to question,
right.
A desire to understand the underlying reasoning.
Uh-huh.
And the evidence. Think of yourself as an investigator always asking, how do we know this?
Yeah.
What's the evidence?
So it's not about blindly accepting or rejecting everything we hear, but it's about engaging with information thoughtfully and discerningly.
Exactly.
It's about asking those right questions, looking for the evidence, and being open to changing our minds if the evidence warrants it.
Exactly. And that applies not just to science,
Ross.
but to all areas of life.
Right.
Whether you're reading a news article, evaluating a political argument, or even making a personal decision, those critical thinking skills are invaluable.
After this deep dive into the philosophy of science, what stands out to you the most? What are some key takeaways our listeners should ponder?
What strikes me most is the dynamic nature of scientific knowledge. It's not about memorizing facts or accepting things at face value.
Right.
It's about cultivating a mindset of curiosity, skepticism, and a constant desire to learn and grow.
So after this exploration of how science works, what are you taking away from this? Which of these ideas resonated with you the most, and how might you apply these insights to your own exploration of the world? Remember, science isn't about finding all the answers. It's about embracing the journey of discovery, questioning everything, and never losing that sense of wonder about the world around us.